You don't like her because she's a psychiatrist.
I'm a complicated man. I loathe her for many reasons.
Never before has a profession been so decried by someone who needed it so badly.
You talk a lot of smack about hookers.
Academia is in danger. A 2015 open science replication of 100 experimental and correlational studies in the field of psychology found that only 36% of their recreations of research produced statistically significant effects, and that of those 100 studies, only 47% reported original effect sizes that reached the typical standard of statistical significance rather than random error, the 95% confidence interval. But if social science is in such a dire state, what then happens when some scholars from a STEM field attempt to conduct a social science survey? The results? Abysmal. A recent paper published in the Journal of Applied Trans Studies, which used statistical methods to examine student experiences in engineering and computer science, gained some notoriety after its publication in mid-2023, with the authors claiming that a significant number of students were racist, sexist, anti-trans, and otherwise bigoted. The responses to this survey were so extreme that one of the researchers reported that they needed to take time off to heal from the supposedly traumatic harm caused from conducting the research. But are the results really as severe and extreme as they sound at face value? Let's look at this study and examine its methods and its findings, beginning by first learning a little bit about how to conduct social science research to understand these supposedly heinous results. But before we can dive into the depths of this ridiculous study, we're going to need some protection, which is where this video's sponsor comes in: private internet access. Much like how research is locked behind paywalls, a ton of movies and TV shows are locked to specific countries, preventing you from getting the most out of your subscriptions to services like Netflix, Hulu, or Disney+, or even being able to digitally rent some media from Amazon. For example, the classic Tarantino film Pulp Fiction is only available on Netflix in Canada. What even is Canada?
What ain't no country I ever heard of? They speak English and what?
Well, that's where private internet access comes in, allowing you to quickly and securely change your location and allowing you access to all that these services have to offer. In addition to opening up your catalog of media, private internet access does what it says on the tin. It protects your privacy online, using secure encryption to keep your browsing away from the prying eyes of companies, malicious actors, and even your own internet service provider, anyone that might be interested in taking a peek. Private internet access has a strict no-logs policy, so you have complete confidentiality in all of your online activities. Whether you're looking at silly scientific studies or something a bit less academic, the service is so dedicated to privacy that you can even pay with cryptocurrency. Additionally, private internet access comes with a built-in ad blocker, which you guys totally wouldn't use while watching my videos, right? The app is also available on all devices or as a browser extension, which also prevents websites from accessing your camera or microphone. All of this comes with 24/7 customer support and a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like the service. Although I think you will. And you can get a special deal on that service by clicking the link down below in the description, or using the QR code on the screen to get 83% off a 2-year plan with private internet access, plus 4 months of service absolutely free. Everyone needs a VPN, so why not make yours private internet access and join their more than 15 million satisfied customers. Thank you so much to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. So, now that we've got some digital armor, it's time to face a study so ridiculous that at several points it has made me laugh out loud. But to understand just how absurd it is, we need to begin by covering just a couple basics of how social science works before we can get into what happens when people with no idea how it works make an attempt at it. Social science can be a complicated field of inquiry, not so much because it uses particularly advanced statistical methods, typically it does not, but because humans are a difficult animal to study, as they are the only animal that is aware that it's being studied. While it may sound like a bunch of
Tommy gobbledygook,
it does actually require some sensitivity. It necessitates that we accept that subjects are very often, if not always, trying to figure out what the researcher is really trying to measure, and thus responses are frequently flippant, insincere, or even outright malicious. If you sign up to participate in a social science study, and I probably shouldn't tell you this, but whatever the purported purpose of that study is, by nature of the field, that's not the actual purpose. It's a cover story, and studies are designed that way precisely because letting participants know what you're studying can bias their responses in a variety of ways. Some will develop a social desirability bias and respond to questions not by giving their own honest opinions, but rather by answering in the way they believe would be seen as most pro-social, or in the way that they believe the researcher wants them to respond. Acquiescence bias.
So one day somebody asks you how you feel, and instead of telling the truth, you reel off a list of things you think they want to hear because it's easier that way. And so they treat you like this completely different person because all they know about you is misinformation.
The people social scientists query also frequently expect researchers to have ulterior motives, and the number of response biases that can influence any one questionnaire or survey are multiplicitous. The best we can do is use tested methodologies to combat this inherent human desire, nay, need to try and figure out the true intentions of the researcher. For this reason, social scientists typically will provide a false premise cover story to any survey or study, as to throw participants off the scent of the intended investigation.
And I don't want to talk to a scientist. Y'all is lying and getting me pissed.
This is particularly relevant when financial compensation is being offered for participation. Subjects don't care about your study, they only care about the payout, obviously, but researchers want them to answer the questions honestly without contamination by knowing what exactly they're studying. This is why, during the post-study debrief, scholars also often query respondents on whether or not they guessed accurately what the true purpose of the study was, and then often throw out those data because the responses could be biased due to the subject having guessed what the researchers were actually trying to study via acquiescence, prosocial, or other biasing effects. The things I have just described are well-known issues within social science research, and for which we have developed methods of compensation. However, what happens when someone from outside of the field attempts to conduct a social science study without the knowledge of research methodology that decades of trial and error have produced? Well, you get this. Research methods are often extremely field-specific. To quote a friend of mine who I asked for help on this project, who is also a Jewish petroleum engineering PhD, not that being Jewish should matter, but it does to these scholars, as we're going to see later, quote,
"If anything, you doing a study on oil diffusing through permeable surfaces would be easier than social science case studies. People lie, rocks don't."
Even though we're all relying on mathematical formulae, at least I would hope so, and also because I don't personally care much about what critical cultural theorists who use their own personal feelings to write academic papers think. The methods through which a biologist or an anthropologist conduct their research is not typically concerned with trying to gather the accurate opinions of a group of people either. That project is the work of social scientists. For social scientists, in turn, data collection methodology is extremely important, as the catastrophic failure we're about to witness illustrates. Methods matter, and the reality of research is that academic fields and their individual methods have become extremely isolated. There is a significant lack of communication between academic fields. For instance, in my PhD program, I was interested in how clothing influenced self-perceptions of the efficacy of an embodied digital avatar. That is, I was curious in how a woman operating a video game character wearing scantily clad clothing would affect play in terms of gameplay outcomes. To get an idea of what I was even trying to study, I had to investigate literature on textile research, which I had no previous idea even existed, only to find that there were entire journals discussing the social importance of textiles. This is a real problem with academia. Our fields are so isolate, and we don't speak to each other, and I think that problem can be no more well represented than in the study titled "Attack Helicopters and White Supremacy: Interpreting Malicious Responses to an Online Questionnaire about Transgender Undergraduate Engineering and Computer Science Student Experiences."
Is the B-2 bomber more detectable when it rains?
Oh, what do you think, Tom Clancy?
Well, the B-2...
No, I was asking Maya Angelou.
The ebony fighter awakens, dappled with the dewy beads of morn.
First authored by environmental engineering PhD Andrea Haverkamp. And yes, you did hear that correctly. And yes, it's going to be silly. But let's examine why from a scientific perspective, which we can begin to do by getting to know our authors. As previously mentioned, the lead author is an environmental engineering PhD, as are two of the other authors, while the additional two authors are a PhD student and an associate professor in the Oregon State University's Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. The PhD student, Finn Johnson, specializes in ethnic studies, while the associate professor, Quilly Driscoll, is a professor of queer studies. Typically speaking, albeit not in all cases, scholars in fields such as women, gender, sexuality, ethnic, and queer studies are critical cultural theorists, or at best qualitative scholars, meaning that they generally don't deal with a lot of hard statistics. After all, their research isn't the only thing that doesn't stand up by itself anymore. But rather, at most, research from these fields concerns qualitative, open-ended responses or non-statistical methodologies such as autoethnographic research, the latter being a very complicated way of saying, I made it up. In this particular case, Dr. Driscoll focuses on rhetoric and poetry and describes themselves as, quote, two-spirit, queer, non-citizen Cherokee, as well as a trans scholar, teacher, and activist, also of African, Irish, Lenape, Lumbee, and Osage ascent. Dr. Driscoll also identifies as, quote, crip and mad. Why they don't also identify as blood is a mystery to me, as all their other identities are a contradiction anyway, so why not both?
¿Por qué no los dos?
Quilly, whose name is legitimately spelled oh whoa, although maybe if Driscoll did identify as a blood, they would also identify as both Suwu and oh whoa.
Imagine reading a post, but over the course of it, the quality seems to deteriorate and gets worse and worse, where the Swenson structure and grammar rewards to a point of utter nonsense. You just don't want to read it anymore, and the whole ordeal is just awful.
Anyway, Dr. Driscoll also says that they have, quote, severe chronic illness as well as complex post-traumatic stress. Looking to Dr. Driscoll's curricula vitae, we can see that their publications are almost entirely poetry, including, quote, another AIDS poem or why do I have to write this, end quote. A good question, as well as, this poem. I'm not reading that.
Gay niggas. Gay niggas.
As for Finn Johnson, and really, as a transgender female to male who gets to pick their name, why on God's green raptor-shaped earth would you, again as I believe a biological female who identifies as a man, call yourself Finn Johnson?
Hey, it's your boy, Skinny Penis.
That's like a male to female calling themselves Urethra Narrow or Mike Oxgon. But I digress. Finn's, being a PhD student, profile on the OSU website does not include a CV. However, there is a video of him and Driscoll introducing themselves, as well as Finn's academic interest in understanding queer and trans experiences in engineering, and hence we find the source of this paper.
Finn is doing really fantastic work. So this year, he's able to have a GTA ship through a NSF grant, looking at the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming students in engineering and computer science.
So these are our two supposed social scientists, or at least the two social science analogs who are working on the study. Someone who chose their two-spirit native name as Oh Whoa, and their advisee, named Finn Johnson. Based on Dr. Driscoll's largely poetry-filled CV and serving as Finn Johnson's advisor on the project, I think it's more than fair to say that neither has much or any experience in publishing quantitative social science research. Looking further at the engineering side of the project, which again will mean scholars largely unfamiliar with social science best practices or any practices, our lead author, Andrea Haverkamp, holds a PhD in environmental engineering with a minor in queer studies and has only presented one other paper at conference titled, quote, The Complexity of Non-Binary Gender Inclusion in Engineering Culture.
I think for engineering, it is very, very, very difficult, and I think in some ways unnecessarily difficult. When we think about the problems we have, why do we structure it so that only one way of thinking and being and learning is valued, and then we aggressively just sort of haze students until the only people remaining are the ones that fit this one specific mold to do this one specific job. A lot of chemical engineering, it sounds cool until you realize 80% of it is oil and petroleum. And I didn't know that because they kind of lie to a lot of incoming students, you know? How does our giant oil and fossil fuel industry keep going? Some of it is deception of kids as young as 18 saying, looking at a college major online and it says chemical engineering, you can change the world with genetic stuff and biomedical stuff and yada, yada, yada. And then you find out everyone at the career fair is pretty much Halliburton, Schlumberger, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Phillips.
Andrea describes her work as utilizing feminist research methods, queer and gender theory, and that it centers trans and gender nonconforming undergraduate students.
Are y'all with the cult?
We're not a cult. We're an organization that promotes love and...
Yeah, this is it.
Haverkamp has also been an outspoken advocate for slacktivism, critiquing the term as a form of ableism, as it, quote, enforces the idea that those who participate as they can, when they can, particularly those who are disabled or impaired, are not making the same impact as those doing real activism, like standing and marching.
The sarcastic bastards gave me a standing ovation. Here's two things you can't do, you poor No, you flesh egg!
The biography of co-author Michelle K. Bothwell, a full professor in the Environmental Engineering Department at Oregon State, describes herself as working, quote, towards a socially just engineering profession, interrogating engineering culture, feminist theory that centers intersectionality, critical disability theory, professional engineering ethics and social responsibility, institutional transformation. Her publications include, quote, Understanding Intersecting Social Identities in Engineering Education and Practice, Towards a Stronger Covalent Bond, Pedagogical Change for Inclusivity and Equity, STEM Women Faculty Struggling for Recognition and Advancement in a Men's Club Culture. Gee, Michelle, I wonder why women faculty are struggling for recognition in engineering when this is what you publish. Other publications include Advancing Women in STEM, Institutional Transformation, and Calling for a Paradigm Shift in the Study of Gender in Engineering Education. Yet not a single paper concerning environmental engineering itself is present in her entire CV. I obtained these articles actually not from her CV, but from Dr. Bothwell's ResearchGate page, as her profile on the Oregon State University website for the Center of Latin At Studies and Engagement contains no CV. Thus, I have no idea what classes she has taught or teaches at OSU, if any. Finally, we have our fifth author. And before I describe his academic bona fides, I do think it's important to note that order in academic publication matters to academics. There are a few ways in which it can work in academia. Sometimes a well-published scholar will take the lead authorship role even if they did little work beyond supervise because their very name gives credence to the veracity of the paper. But in more recent years, this particular practice has fallen out of use as it does somewhat fail to highlight the importance of the work of scholars who actually conducted the project. Other times, the advisor will take second author position precisely because being first author is important in establishing credibility in academia, and especially so for a young and upcoming scholar. Last place is typically reserved for someone who either did very little work on the project, or by choice for scholars who may want to add another citation to their CV, yet not particularly want to associate his or her name with that paper. And I think the latter is probably what we have here in the case of environmental engineer Dr. Delvin B. Montfort, although admittedly, that's nothing more than speculation on my part. Unlike his colleagues, Dr. Montfort appears to actually teach courses on environmental engineering process, surveying, and mechanics. In fact, he seems to be the only person involved who teaches courses at all. His publications appear to be largely concerned with engineering pedagogy and teaching, as with the others. However, I find little evidence of a research focus on women, sexual, gender, or ethnicity studies, and at most a couple of articles only going so far as to concern student inclusion. Hard to imagine that the only person who appears to be doing any actual work in this department is French.
They are a bunch of treacherous, lamb-burning, workshy peasants.
I believe this is why the only person with seemingly any publications or serious background in environmental engineering is fifth and final author in the study that we're about to examine. Because he probably did have little to do with it, but he probably also doesn't really want to be associated with it. While in contrast, the others are clamoring to be associated with it, or at least they probably were before it went viral. Imagine the French not wanting to be associated with something. This is the academic equivalent of Algiers. But speaking of that study, let's look at Attack Helicopters and White Supremacy, Interpreting Malicious Responses to an Online Questionnaire about Transgender Undergraduate Engineering and Computer Science Student Experiences, And what happens when a bunch of woke gender studies poets and feminist scholars, regardless of what their degrees are actually in, decide to delve for the very first time, without any methodological knowledge, into actual empirical social science research? For as silly and pointless as you may think social science to be, and I will be the first to admit it often is, just wait till you see what happens when people who don't know what they're doing make an attempt at it. So, let's look at those actual methods.
Sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted sorrow.
Following an abstract that spoils the surprise, which I will not spoil for you, dear viewer, the paper begins unusually without describing its purpose or rationale, bucking all normative trends of academic literature, and instead opens with the authors noting that their study, a study we have yet to be introduced to the very meaning of, as receiving much praise in emails from students, until, to their horror, the following comment arrived via email.
I believe that is what is wrong with higher education. Students should be taught to focus on their chosen field and not their gender. In my program, I'm sure there are students that fall into the categories you are researching, but the performance is how they are judged. Stop trying to push gender and convince people that they're more important or discriminated against just because how they identify. Let people choose their own path and don't force them into fields just because you think a group isn't represented enough. In today's world, people can be what they want to be regardless of their gender or race. All you're doing is propagating a stereotype and pushing a divide between groups. Also, the fact that you are funded by the NSF is an enormous waste and not science. That money could be used for real research that could actually better things. Good luck with your research.
Take a moment, dear friends, to really savor this brief bit of clarity as we delve deeper, as these breaths of fresh air will be few and far between. Additionally, the name wasn't the only thing that was redacted, as the opening of the email and thus the impetus behind the student participants' full meaning is lost. Of course, they should probably have redacted the entire paper. However, I think it's unquestionable that this email is not particularly rude nor insensitive, merely critical of whatever it was that these researchers were doing. Again, they have not yet told us in the paper itself what they were doing, treating their research like it's the back page blurb of a Tom Clancy novel. The scholars then inform us that this was one of the kinder responses they received, which, considering the title, begs the question, why would this be the included email rather than one of the less kind responses, if you're trying to prove a point that you're being victimized? But let's move into what exactly apparently was so contentious about this study. And what was the study about? Well, the experiences of transgender and gender nonconforming TGNC students in the engineering and computer science department at various US universities. From what I've been able to glean, it seems that this was probably intended to be the doctoral thesis of Finn Johnson.
DJ No Dick! Call 1-800 DJ No Dick!
But due to the responses that their own poor methodology produced, the scholars instead published it as an independent piece of research, which I believe is further backed up by the fact that they state they had been working on the paper since 2020. You heard that right, they worked on this for 2, if not 3 years. In that time span, the authors explained that they were influenced by Florida's banning of in elementary schools, representing a fascist ideological threat to TGNC engineering and computer science students at OSU. They move on to discuss the fact that 60.7% of computer science baccalaureates are awarded to men, and 77.5% of engineering baccalaureates were similarly awarded to men, as being representative of a lack of gender parity in the fields, as well as lamenting that the vast majority of research concerning engineering pedagogy has revolved around, in their words, a quote, cisgender, gender-binary, Eurocentric framework. And thus this paper, 2 or 3 years in the making, was designed to combat that foci. In regard specifically to trans issues and online harassment, as that is the ultimate topic of the study, not the experiences of TGNC STEM students, they note that 15% of comments on topics of transgender issues on social media are negative, with one study reporting 50% negative responses to the topic of transgender individuals using the restroom that aligns with their gender identity, as well as transgender topics dominating much discourse in right-leaning commentary. These are findings from other studies, and I see no reason to contest them. Yes, a lot of people do have a negative opinion on transgender people in general, and particularly as it concerns their involvement in sport and the use of bathrooms. And yes, it is conservative pundits and politicians who largely discuss these concerns. Why? Because the left doesn't, outside of overt affirmation. I don't have any issue with transgender people. To use the tired old phrase, I have trans friends. But to pretend that the reason behind the coverage and negativity is baseless is being disingenuous.
Riley Gaines posted video on Twitter last night saying she was confronted by a trans rights activist. Gaines is a former competitor of controversial trans swimmer Leah Thomas. Gaines says police escorted her to safety and that she was forced to barricade for 3 hours in a classroom. The university says police did not make any arrests, but that it is conducting an investigation.
The scholars hypothesize that engineering and computer science TGNC students are at perhaps particular risk for harassment and discrimination due to the nerdy nature of the field, seemingly being unaware of the programming socks meme.
It really, dude, don't program. This is the path you go down. Oh, you can code? It's a matter of time.
And stating that these fields, quote, share workplace and recreational proximity to online subcultures, including video gaming and nerddom, which similarly present barriers to those not within a white, cis-male, heterosexual norm, while not inherently white nationalist, and indeed can offer potent rebukes to such ideologies. These are locations where the issue of radicalization into white supremacist and white nationalist movements is endemic, end quote. Again, clearly they're not aware of the politics of people with programming socks. After all, so many transgender people do tend to find themselves either in the far left or far right. What is it about Crusader Kings that does this to people?
So what, just gas everybody we don't like?
Well, you had no problem gashing me, and I never got back my copy of Hearts of Iron.
The scholars go on to define the ubiquity and endemic nature of white supremacy and white nationalism as omnipresent in all aspects of society, despite often being, if not always, undetectable. You know you're in for a robust scientific analysis when the literature review admits that they're trying to measure the immeasurable. The authors continue to describe online vectors of radicalization, including 4chan, YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit. I'm guessing they aren't aware that Reddit is so left-leaning that they banned the Donald Trump subreddit? Or that Twitter banned Donald Trump himself? Look, whatever you think about Trump, I don't think he's a white supremacist nor a neo-Nazi, as the researchers here imply these online communities are full of. Now, 4chan, you've got an argument there, particularly if you're only looking at the politically incorrect board, and not boards like LGBT, which exist on 4chan. But Reddit?
You wouldn't last 3 minutes on some of the subreddits that I happen to manage. They're all NSFW, and they're all full of real girls.
They also note the supposed overlap between neo-Nazi communities and misogynist communities, specifically mentioning men's rights, red pill, and pickup artist circles, and that this constellation of online hate groups often refer to themselves as trolls.
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
Describing their behavior as, quote, weaponized humor. We're all, of course, very well aware of the dangers of jokes.
In action, it was deadly.
With this bias in mind, the scholars move on to discuss their research methods and conceptual framework for their study at hand, which are, of course, anti-fascist and queer methodologies. What is anti-fascist methodology? Well, it's a method that supposedly challenges fascist ideology. What are fascist ideologies? The authors describe them as 1. A movement-building base dedicated to creating a new order. 2. A process of rooting in the political system. 3. Obtaining power. 4. Exercising power. And 5. Either entering a decline period or a period of compromise called entropy, or a radicalization by hardcore fascist groups who advocate a second revolution. I wonder if you, dear viewer, can think of any other political group or ideology that doesn't engage in at least 4, if not all 5, of those points. Sure is a mystery to me.
You know, this Vanguard Party rule is quite similar to the one we had under the Tsar.
Oh, patented Leninism, old Marxist dialectic.
For democratic centralism.
Yes.
And yet you call it democratic centralism, despite the fact that it is obviously bourgeois dictatorship.
You know, one thing I should... Excuse me for 1 second.
I'm just saying that every single point of this description of fascism could be applied to communism. Now, do the scholars describe how they plan to implement these anti-fascist methods in their own work? Oh, absolutely not. Maybe at bayonet point, but who knows? Not me, and not them. Perhaps they'll do better in describing trans and queer methodologies.
Hey, I doubt it!
The scholars describe trans and queer methods as, quote, to queer is to destabilize normativity and the nature of knowledge and its power as a universal truth. Which, who has any idea what that means?
Sheer hubris.
And therefore a queer methodology will destabilize traditional research trajectories and act as an interpretive project, all of which could be colloquially described as a salad bar of nonsense.
Commie gobbledygook.
Again, how does one implement any of this into research? Unclear, undefined, unanswered. They further note the intersectional nature of the supposed methodology as, quote, viewing domination itself as encompassing intersecting oppressions of race, class, gender, sexuality, and notion points to the significance of these oppressions in shaping the overall organization of a particular matrix of domination. Similarly, personal identities constructed around individual understandings of race, class, gender, sexuality, and nation define each individual's unique biography. A matrix of domination? Sounds like a bad tag team from the early days of wrestling. Again, there's no description of how this is to be applied to the data or data analysis, only that the scholars are conducting the research from a Black feminist framework, their words. Now, I want to take a moment to look at a real piece of research to give you an idea of what this section would typically look like in actual academic literature. Let's examine this study on a similar topic to that of Haverkamp et al. Concerning indicators of engineering students' success and persistence in their academic program from French, Emekes, and Oakes, 2005. There is no discussion of ideological frameworks, but instead a clear statement of the study's purpose, a literature review, an explanation of how the data were collected, the demographic makeup of the sample, the assessed independent variables, in this case, gender, high school rank, participation in an orientation course, SAT scores, motivation, and institutional integration, as well as the measured dependent variables, university GPA, university enrollment, and enrollment in engineering as a major. The scholars in this study, however, then do move on to a more normal format by describing their data analysis using hierarchical multiple linear regressions, which allows researchers to determine how much one variable predicts another. I picked that study from French, Emekes, and Oakes at absolute random, but any social science paper will look very similar to it, which is very dissimilar from Haverkamp et al. And there's a very good reason for similarity. Consistency in formatting, clear explanation of the study's purpose and the variables being measured, as well as how the relationship between those variables are being assessed, is standard formatting because it allows other scholars to easily and uniformly read research, such as to immediately understand the why and the how of its methods. We don't use APA citation and formatting style because it's fun or because it's elitist. We do so because it's uniform, so all scholars can understand quickly what is happening in the paper. When I look at Haverkamp et al.'s paper, it lacks all standards of social science academic formatting, which is a first major red flag within the paper itself that the people involved have no idea what they're doing. Now, I'm sure they know quite a lot about Black feminist queer autoethnographic experiences in engineering, but they don't know anything about how to format, and as we'll soon see more importantly, conduct a social science survey to their own detriment. Going to the section specifically labeled methods, Haverkamp et al. Simply state that they will be using a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative methods concern pure mathematics, while qualitative methods rely most frequently on open-ended responses, typically coded by inter-rater analysis to look for themes within those responses. Oh, and we're gonna find some themes here. And of course, they didn't use inter-rater analysis with trained coders in a code book, they just kind of reacted to the responses themselves without any coding. The scholars note that they used Qualtrics, which I point out now because I'm well familiar with Qualtrics, and when I really get into the enormous failures of this attempt at social science surveying, I'm going to show you how, in Qualtrics, they could have easily avoided their pitfalls. The Qualtrics survey itself was short, containing 16 Likert-type items, that is, questions that are phrased usually on a scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree, as well as 7 open-ended questions. The scholars sent out the link to the Qualtrics survey to 3,000 faculty members at engineering departments across the US for distribution to students. Now we get into the major screw-up that caused the study to exist at all. Subjects were informed that completion of the survey would reward them with an Amazon gift card worth $5.
So you want to win $5?
Hey, what did I win?
Nothing!
That's actually quite a big prize for participation as far as social science goes. Typically, completion of research counts towards coursework or simply provides food and drink as a reward. If it does include financial compensation, it's rarely as significant as $5, which I know sounds like very little, but is actually above average considering the short length of the survey. A report from Chef, 2018,
Oh, you haven't seen Chef? It's a fantastic download it on Amazon, $3. Chef.
found that the average hourly compensation for completion of a survey was $20 or 33 cents a minute. But this study would have probably taken about 10 minutes to complete, so an average payout for such a study would more realistically be between $1 to $3. I pointed this all out because for a college student, a $5 gift card or 5 to 10 minutes of work is a pretty lucrative deal, and if it seems like I'm being pedantic, hang on, because the value of the card is something that's going to come up frequently in the malicious responses that this study received.
Chili's. There's still $2.15 on it. I'm gonna use it when I take out your girl.
$2.15?
Yeah.
I got a date on Tuesday.
The other major bungling, which compounded with the promise of the gift card in producing the results that we'll soon discuss, was the study's inclusion criteria as being an engineering or computer science student and self-identification as transgender or gender nonconforming. So now I would like you to engage in a little thought experiment, dear viewer. Pretend you are an engineering or computer science undergraduate student, as I'm sure some of you watching are or have been in the past. You have received an email from your department promising a reward of a $5 Amazon gift card for completing a short survey about your experiences in higher education, and when you get to the landing page, after confirming that you are an engineering or computer science student, the study asks you if you are transgender or gender nonconforming. Statistically, 99.4% of you are not. So, when you select no, the study says you are ineligible to receive the gift card and closes itself. How would that make you feel? Probably a little bit cheated, right? Maybe a lot cheated. Maybe it makes you feel rather angry. That's because what has just been induced is psychological reactance. Reactance is a negative emotional state produced when we feel that our freedoms have been restricted. Often we want to do things just because someone told us that we couldn't or shouldn't do them, which is why I often refer to reactance as the Didi effect.
Please, do not push the button. You have no idea what it...
Now, if I was conducting this study, or if any social scientist was conducting this study, I wouldn't do that. There's a very easy solution to this problem which would not induce reactance, which is to simply allow all participants to complete the survey regardless of their gender identity, and then only award the gift card to those who answered that they identified as TGNC. It's simple to do this using the logic function in Qualtrics such that everyone can complete the study, but only those who responded in the affirmative to the inclusion criteria condition received the gift card, rather than booting them from the survey altogether. I've constructed a representation in Qualtrics to illustrate what a portion of this study would look like, and you can see the logic function kicking me from the survey if I report that I am not an engineering or computer science student, or that I do not identify as TGNC. Qualtrics' built-in suggestion feature even says not to do this, so there really is no excuse. But again, remember that no one involved in this study has ever conducted social science research before. Most of them have never conducted a survey before, and thus are woefully ignorant of social science best practices. But when Qualtrics itself is giving me a warning to not do this, at some point I'm forced to believe it's not just ignorance, it's also hubris. Again, all you would need to do is allow all subjects to complete the form, but only award the gift card to those who met the inclusion criteria. Don't frame the study as a guarantee of a gift card, but rather a chance to win one, and then simply exclude those whose data, that is, those who do not identify as TGNC, from the reward? Is it arguably unethical to tell students that they have a chance to win a gift card when statistically 99.4% of them don't really have a chance? Arguably yes, but students would be none the wiser as to why they didn't win if you didn't kick them before they could finish the study when they answered no to the transgender or non-conforming question. Now, because you've angered them, because you've excluded them, you've generated psychological reactance. And this is important, you've also given them a very clear reason as to why they have been excluded, their gender identity, which devastates any cover story that you could have had, and they didn't have one, regarding the study being about anything other than TGNC STEM students. I won't even go into how exclusion from participation for financial compensation based on gender identity could be seen as potentially legally discriminatory, even though studies do this all the time. But again, in almost every instance, the participant is none the wiser as to the reason for their exclusion. Either way, this frustrating setup was exacerbated by the study's online nature, as online surveys are more prone to de-individuation effects. That is, anonymized people, de-individuated people, do not feel the need to acclimate to normative social niceties and often engage in toxic disinhibition due to that anonymity. Social scientists have long studied the toxic effects of anonymity. In perhaps the most seminal example, Dr. Philip Zimbardo in 1969 utilized a similar structure to that of the infamous Milgram obedience experiment, instructing subjects to give what they believed to be an electrical shock to someone who they were told was another study participant, but was really an actor, a research Confederate. Some of these Confederates had bags placed over their heads, and Zimbardo found that subjects were twice as likely to give a painful electric shock to those Confederates whose identity was obscured by the bag, believing themselves to be anonymized from the person whom they were causing harm. When anonymized via the internet, not being able to see the reactions or reality of the person behind the screen, Solar 2005 described this tendency to be cruel or to troll when anonymized as the online disinhibition effect. These effects are well known by social scientists, but not by these authors. So let me give a couple of pointers to the researchers here in case they ever want to conduct a survey again. First of all, you need to get someone with the clue on your team, clearly, to help you avoid the massive errors that you made here. And let's be very clear, Havercapital, the malicious responses that you received to this survey are the result of your error and your error alone. Secondly, if you're going to conduct survey research on human participants, you need to learn just a little bit about human psychology and social science best practices. Relatedly, if you want to study a very specific, very small population, such as TGNC students, it's probably better to use purposive sampling methods rather than an online random sampling method. You sent these emails to 3,000 faculty members. You could have asked them to do some snowball sampling. You could have asked them to forward the emails to their institution's Gay-Straight Alliance, for example. Why on God's green helical earth did you use random, anonymous, online sampling? Because again, you had no idea what you were doing. And finally, regarding future tips on conducting social science surveys, it's probably better if you just don't.
I would really prefer if you would be quiet.
I am all in favor of interdisciplinary scholarship, as I mentioned earlier, but I think it's really probably best if you stop while you're behind. And I say that because, well, let's move on to those malicious responses that were the actual subject of this paper, not TGNC student experiences in computer science and engineering. So here's what happened. After students were booted from the survey because they're not a part of an extremely small portion of the population that identifies as transgender or gender nonconforming, again, something purposive sampling rather than random sampling would have avoided, yeah, they were miffed, they were peeved, they were experiencing a loss of freedom, psychological reactance, and more importantly, the loss of a $5 Amazon gift card. What then did these reactance-ridden anonymous students do? Well, they opened up another browser or deleted their cookies, reopened the survey and did a little trolling to try and get that gift card. In total, 723 students participated in the survey, but of these, only 299 met the inclusion criteria, consented to participate, and fully completed the form. 374 failed to meet the inclusion criteria of being a computer science or engineering student and identifying as TGNC, failed to consent to participation, or failed to complete the form in its entirety. 50 subjects did meet the inclusion criteria, but were categorized as malicious, the subjects of interest to us today. I did notice that the engineers who wrote this made a very basic mathematical error, certainly on accident, and not because the entire point of this exercise is now self-victimization because some anonymous college kids that you yourselves pissed off decided to troll you, and that is that the researchers report that the malicious responses comprised 15% of their total sample. No, they didn't. 50 malicious responses out of a sample of 723 actually makes up 6.9% of the sample. In statistics, by the way, anything falling under 5% can and often is chalked up to random error in terms of significance. And these responses, making up just under 7%, are falling pretty close to random error statistically, error that, again, was induced by the scholars themselves. Now, because of that induced reactance, and because of the open-ended responses, I would say that there is a pretty good chance that all of the malicious responses were from the same group who were originally kicked from the study because they failed to meet the TGNC inclusion criteria. So if we do some quick maths, and presume that to be the case, something we have no real evidence for but reasonable reasons to believe is the case, then the percentage of malicious responses increases to 7.4% of the total sample. So where did that 15% come from?
Let's just pull something out of our ass. Oh, what'd we find in our ass? It was the Hulk. Who knew?
Well, it's because the scholars just excluded all of the subjects who failed to actually meet the inclusion criteria, seemingly intentionally to inflate the prevalence of the malicious response. There is no other way to describe this other than an outright misrepresentation of data, and for that alone the study probably should be retracted. But I get the feeling that the Journal of Applied Trans Studies doesn't care too much about academic integrity. I could be wrong. What's worse is that their own basic calculation using this warped analysis is still wrong. If we only include the 299 responses that met the inclusion criteria, then the 50 malicious responses comprise 16.7%, which in such reporting you would round up to 17%, not 15%. These are allegedly engineers, and every single possible way of looking at how they calculated this percentage is wrong. But let's look at those 50 malicious respondents, which comprised realistically just under 7% of the respondents, not 15%. And if you're wondering why it took so long, well, I had to give the background for one, and for another, YouTube really doesn't like when you say the things that I'm about to read early in a video. So yeah, let's get into it. Of the 50, 12 listed their gender as some form of helicopter or aircraft. From the 30 who also stated that they had a disability, 15 reported being transgender as their disability. Some selected examples of the interplay of intersectional identities in this group, including participant number 2, who identified as aerosol gender of Afro-Klingon Asiatic Galapagosian heritage, and being disabled due to being 2.86% white. Participant 17 identified as airplane gender of Native American, specifically Elizabeth Warren heritage, and being disabled due to transgenderism. Participant 24 identified as white male. Excuse me. Participant 24, it's a common mistake, but it's a white male.
You're a white male!
Much like Kamala Harris, and of Swedish Muslim heritage, and being disabled because the country is run by communists.
It's called free speech. No, it's called hate speech. You're communist.
Participant 31 identified as a pansexual attack helicopter of Kang's heritage and reported being disabled due to an intracranial lead deficiency. Then we have participant 20, and I've saved them for last here because their response to the demographic questions were quite lengthy, who identified as, quote, a boy when I'm getting f***ed and a girl when I'm the one My dick goes inside out so it changes.
I turn into a telescope when I see your page.
Of, quote, black on the inside when I'm a boy, I like getting my ass you know what I'm saying, bruh, heritage.
Know what I'm saying? Saying know what I'm saying too many times. 80, 90 times? That's too many times.
And being disabled due to being, quote, sexually attracted to the thought of being eaten alive. I know this sounds like a joke, but I'm being serious. I'm a macro/vorophile, and I jack off almost every night to the thought of giantess women shoving me up her ass to dip me in her sauce, and then throwing my body into her giant mouth. This isn't a joke. I'm sexually and I jack off to death. The doctors say I have a disease, but I find that really hard to believe. So, you all understand why I'm talking about this study now, right? Other genders included 2 subjects who were both gift cards, literal fluid, Big Chungus, and quasi-demi-pony Bankai released state queercopter with a hint of drag lesbian and homosexual upside-down frappuccino cake. Other racial and ethnic identities included, quote, come on man, these questions are stupid. Everyone is a grab bag of genetics from all over the world. Crip, similarly to Dr. Driscoll,
I want to say we drop bloods into Berlin, but...
Winston Churchill throwing up Crip outside the Reichstag.
US military, did you just assume my race, in all caps, Smurf, Saiyan, Black Twitter, and again, gift card. Other disabilities included having hands where the feet are and feet where the hands are, being too ballin' homie.
Ballin', but at what cost?
And of course, once again, not having enough gift cards. Several participants expressed irritation with the purpose of the questions at all, with subjects 10, 16, and 29 all stating in various ways that race and gender identity were unimportant. They could have trolled, but they didn't. They merely complained, and yet were still considered by the researchers to be malicious respondents. Open-ended responses, however, gave participants a far larger form with which to express either their grievances with the study or to troll the researchers. A common theme was critique of diversity, equity, inclusion, and affirmative action policies, which participant 41 referred to as a privilege point system, and 39 described succinctly as bullshit. Penn and Teller, is that you? 31 similarly stated that the survey had nothing to do with their degree program. In response to the question, quote, what are your strengths and skills in engineering and computer science classrooms or projects? Participant 15 responded, quote, I'm trans, obviously I will have a job regardless of my skills thanks to diversity quotas and inspired by surveys such as these. While participant 43, who we're going to be seeing a lot of, said, quote, I don't actually have any skills, I'm just a diversity affirmative action student. Despite the fact that many of the responses were cordial, the researchers still categorized them as malicious. As subject 5, who identified as an ethnically diverse Apache attack helicopter and responded to a question asking for general comments, stated, quote, well, I of course do not condone bullying or discrimination. I wish people in universities, especially the faculty, would not focus so much on gender and identity. That doesn't matter. Just let people do their thing and teach them how to do Gauss eliminations and whatnot. That's a very level-headed response for someone who is supposedly malicious. They're not malicious, they're punished. A student denied their gift card.
Where's the money, Lebowski? Where's the money, Lebowski?
The sentiment that the research was pointless and a waste of time was also expressed by participant 47, a dangerous number to piss off and certainly wouldn't be the first time someone given that designation had been called a skinhead, who reported only being here for the gift card and said, quote, please do some research on something that will actually benefit the human race. This notion that these quacks are normal is crazy. Honestly, they make engineering courses more a pain in the ass. Why can't they just sit down and learn the material like the rest of us and stop making everything about themselves? Good question, number 47. Similarly, subject 13, a self-described identitarian attack helicopter possible Smurf, simply asked how the study even got funding in the first place. Well, subject 13, the answer is the National Science Foundation. That's how.
NSF, ensuring U.S. global leadership through investments that expand the frontiers of knowledge and technology and support an increase in the STEM workforce in critical fields such as artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and the environment. The National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin.
These responses, despite being labeled as such, don't strike me as particularly malicious. They're criticisms of what the students reasonably see as a waste of time and money, which the scholars responded to in their paper by saying that diversity quotas don't exist.
University of California versus Bakke struck down the use of racial quotas for university and college admissions, but it said race could be one of many factors in evaluating an applicant. 1979, United Steelworkers of America versus Weber said private sector employers and unions could implement voluntary affirmative action plans to remedy past discrimination.
And that affirmative action policies, since overturned by the Supreme Court, by the way, but not as of the time of the writing and publication of this study, have nothing to do with LGBTQI+ communities and thus are irrelevant to their questions, despite identifying their research approach as Black feminism, and despite none of them being Black, but two identities, race and sex, that absolutely were relevant to affirmative action, and hence relevant here, despite the author's protestations. The next theme that the researchers identified was gender binary discourse, as 4 participants responded to the gender identity question with some variation of the phrase, quote, "There are only 2 genders." Of course, a biological reality, and something that applies to 99.98% of human beings who are not born with an intersex disorder. But I'm sure these scholars would say that being a cisgendered woman, I shouldn't even be allowed to comment on intersex disorders. So let me instead ask my intersex friend what she thinks about the gender binary.
Okay, my name's Yiz, as you can see. I go by Yiz the Eunuch. That's my online name, and that will become apparent why here in a little while. I am I guess you could call me just a regular content creator. I have a podcast, I make videos, I talk to other people such as yourself. The reason that I'm here today is I am intersex. So we'll start there. Back to you.
Which I don't think should matter, honestly, but it does matter to the scholars. But it also does probably matter in some ways, as you've told me before, that it's important to get the real takes of people, the real opinions of people, if you're going to be speaking for them, as these scholars in fact try to do, which is why I reached out to you over this. So first, what do you think about that 1 in 100 statistic?
Well, to me, that sounds ludicrous. I don't even think 1 in 100 people are homosexual, let alone the more unique unicorns in the alphabet mafia. The way that it was explained to me in the 90s, when I first got help, it was from a husband and wife team that had a private practice. And for 30 years, they had worked with fertility issues, hormone issues, intersex problems, gonadular development issues, primarily with females, but sometimes males too. And the way it was told to me is that intersex conditions are probably only between 1 in 50 to 1 in 80,000 births. And there are, at the time, he told me there were like 15 or 16 major intersex conditions. And the number 1 in 100 is just absolutely laughable. And I think that the weasel word there for that 1 in 100 was intersex characteristic, because characteristic is not a scientific term really in this case. So they can call anything an intersex characteristic. Heavy eyebrows, being a tomboy, I don't know, like they could call anything that. And we talked off air a little bit about it, and you said that not just personally you think it's bunko, but it was disproven later to be bunko, right?
Yes.
The study that 1 in 100 comes from. Yeah.
Yes, it was. Well, it was contested.
To let everybody know, I'm not a researcher. I don't work in medicine. I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I was told a lot about intersex conditions, and of course I've lived with it for years. So, you know, I have probably more experience with it than your average bear. And I don't think that anybody sensible that I would respect in medicine would say minor things that are not directly involved with gonad and genital mutations and chromosomal mutations. Anything outside of that, I don't think would technically be intersex, because that's the only thing that technically is intersex, because sex means your sex, your genetics, and what makes you male or female, which is your gonads and your genitals. So before we move further, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I will share with you the kind of intersex I am. And it goes nicely with the second claim after the 1 in 100 thing about the binary gender being false or not supported by modern science or whatever it was. I think that's crap. I think that's a lie. I'm male, by the way. I'm a male that looks kind of like a woman, I guess, and I have lived as a woman most of my adult life since a teenager. The issue that I had was gonadular hermaphroditism. Used to be called hermaphroditism. In the modern era, it's called ovotestes. It's where when you're born, I'm XXY, male ovotestes are XXY. It's where your gonads, or in most cases, one of your gonads, is an ovary with a functional testicle inside of it. And then the other one will just be a small atrophied or mutated testy that's not very functional or not functional at all, which was my case. And it causes severe problems in adolescence because your X chromosome and your Y chromosome both kind of activate, and they try to do start and stop male and female puberties back and forth. And so my adolescence was hell. I had night terrors, hot flashes, rage, anger, confusion, paranoia. It was misery. And until I got help for that, my parents didn't know what to do. It was really rough. It was an all-around hard time. And to not go into too much detail about, you know, my body and stuff, I haven't had any surgeries. This is just how I developed. I don't have an Adam's apple. I grew breasts and hips like a woman. It was a weird, hard time for me, especially here in rural Appalachia. So it's not, this kind of thing is not a fad. It's not an identity. It's not something that should be celebrated or treated like it's normal. And I think that the people that are behind these kind of studies want to normalize the abnormal and encourage delusions for their own ideological ends. And when I sought medical help, insurance didn't cover me. And so as I became older, 19, 20, 21, I got introduced to and became part of what I call the alphabet mafia activists. And I noticed that they believed in things that weren't true, and that science at the time didn't agree with either, even though now it's starting to and has for a while. And so I quickly learned that people like the woman who made this study, they do not have help and assistance and do no harm in mind. They have political, ideological agenda in mind, and they want to use people like me as their smoking gun or missing link proof for their nonsensical, delusional non-science. And that was hard for me because I had to be around people that on the surface seemed like me, and they thought I was one of them, so they would talk openly around me, and they would say very ugly, untoward things about pretty much everything that I hold dear, normalcy, traditional living, Christianity. They would say things like, we can only make more of us by stealing theirs, and they would celebrate, converting children and stuff. Really sick stuff.
Well,
yeah.
I'm not
and
shocked,
and remember, this is going back to the early aughts, and it was a very ugly thing for me to learn back then because, I was young, and I thought that, hey, these people say they want to help me, they want to advocate for me to get, my insurance to cover the annual treatments that I need and that kind of thing. And it was just a very ugly, eye-opening experience that the people involved in this in academia and medicine and these alphabet mafia advocates, they don't want to help at all. They just want to do anything that forwards their agenda. And people like me and the people who have genuine cross-sex or trans-sex issues, they don't help them. They only hurt them. The vast majority of everyone that I met that were trans, they were just confused and abused young people, and they were not being helped at all. They were being encouraged. Their delusions and their problems were being not just encouraged, but rewarded by nurses and doctors and psychiatrists that were all part of this alphabet mafia. It was very sick. It was very sick what I discovered. And thank you for having me on to talk about it, because I think that this is what they don't want you to know. They don't want you to hear about this because it hurts their narrative and it disempowers the thing that they push, which is they're trying to push transgenderism on people younger and younger and younger. And they use people like me as scientific proof that what they're saying is valid when it's not. To elaborate a little more on the gender binary, sex binary, and how people that, according to the study, the people who were gender nonconforming or whatever it is they said that they were, they also said that gender binary is real. And again, I will cite my experiences with these people. The activist types, these transgender ideology people that started taking over in the aughts, all through medicine and insurance and psychology and everything. The few genuine different people, like I do believe that some people, very few as they are genuinely born transsex or homosex, right? Like they do genuinely have those issues from birth, but they're very few and far between. And those people, especially the transsexual people who have been either messed up in usually in the mind, but also sometimes with the body from childhood, they also do not like this movement, this ideology that seeks to erase or annul gender. Because if you are a genuine transsex person, then you know that you have to pick one. You are between two things. So those two things have to exist. And these people that want to make light of that and say that it's either a social construct or there is no real sex, it's the same thing about these people that say there is no race and like that racial genetic differences don't make any difference. Well, people that work in medicine and healthcare know that's not true, because you need to know someone's ethnic genetic background makeup to know what genetic disorders they might be prone to know how different medications interact with certain types of human genetics that are different across ethnic and racial lines. So when these people seek to annul that, they annul the struggle and the problems that people like me and these transsex people have, the genuine ones, not the sad delusional people that have been talked into it, but the few genuine ones that I met, they also didn't like this gender doesn't real stuff that they're pushing, because it just completely bulldozes away all of their struggle, all of their identity problems, and it makes light of it like it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter to these activists. Remember that. These ideologically driven people like made this study, they don't care about the transsex people. They don't care about the intersex people. They're just going to use us for their ends. And none of us that are genuine, down-to-earth, sensible people, whether we're heterosexual, homosexual, intersex, transsex, none of us who understand and don't live in a delusion, we all believe that gender is binary and that you are the sex you were born, and that's just how it is. It doesn't matter what medication you take or what surgeries you get, you are male or female as you were born, as God made you, whatever you believe. You are that until the day you die. There's nothing you can do about it. Your genes are your genes, your body is your body, and that's what you have. And so even transsex, intersex people, and homosexual people I've talked to, the ones that are not lunatics, the ones that don't buy into this, they believe that too. Yeah. And that's and the people that make this study, they don't want to hear that. So they want to silence me and call me names just like they call you names.
100%. Well, I guess we'll find out. Did you have any specific thoughts about the comments that were left on the study? And would you consider them to be malicious?
First of all, no, they're definitely not malicious. Obviously, they're malicious to this person because they live in their own ideological bubble. But no, the only borderline malicious comments that I saw of all the ones that we looked at together were the jokey, trolly 4chan ones, like identifying as an attack helicopter and saying, dumb things. I wouldn't consider that malicious. That's just people having fun doing 4chan stuff. That's not malicious. But no, the many serious comments that we looked at together, they were not malicious at all. They were just contradictory. And you can tell someone lives in an ideological bubble when contradiction and criticism they interpret as a malicious attack. And so it's very obvious how ideologically driven and what kind of delusional bubble the person who made this study lives in when they ask a trans or an intersex person for their opinion. And then when that person's opinion doesn't align with theirs, they call it malicious. Like that's childish. That's childish, immature, and someone like that has no business having any clout at all in academia.
And speaking of, do you have yourself any comments for the authors of this study who have claimed that they are the victims of attack because they've received some nasty comments?
A younger me might have said something ugly, but I have gotten kinder and wiser in my age. And I believe that people who do evil oftentimes don't realize they are. And I think that everyone can be redeemed. Everyone that's not, born with, a bad brain that makes them a crazy murderer or something. Like, most people are not like that. And even people like this woman that made the study, who is ideologically driven, who lives in a bubble of delusion, I think that she can stop being evil. And I believe that anybody can. So if she ever hears my words, and if anybody that worked on this study or is part of the Alphabet Mafia hears me, you can stop living a lie. You can stop pushing lies and encouraging harmful delusions in young people. You don't have to do that anymore. And you can do like I do and speak positively and with love to try to fix these problems. I know that you might have been a part of this ugly movement for a long time. It might have been what defined you for many years. But you can walk away from that. You can choose to do what's right. You can choose to be a better person, a good person who cares about others and stops these harmful lies. And I hope and pray that you do, and that you make better choices. I did, and my life is better for it. And I want that for you too.
Of the open-ended responses that specifically mentioned gender binary, they seemed to originate organically without any specific prompts from the researchers outside of the survey itself, which, as I have described, evoked the topic by booting students from participation if they did not identify as transgender or gender non-conforming. For example, in response to the question, quote, "Do you have friends, classmates, or family who support your success in engineering as it relates to your race, sexuality, disability status, religious affiliation, or other identities? If so, how do they provide support for you in your engineering program?" Participant 29 said, quote, "I really can't be bothered at this point. You're ruining genuine scientific disciplines here." I agree, 29. There are two genders, male and female. If an engineer creates a bolt and a nut, but then whimsically labels them, then they are not that great of an engineer. Similarly, in reaction to being asked if they had any additional comments for the researchers, participant 27 reported, quote, "Your research is bullshit, and there is no such thing, and non-binary genders, you're either male or female with the rare exception of someone born with both, which is probably the result of a genetic disorder. Therefore, if someone thinks they are born in the wrong body, they have a mental disorder." The researchers responded to participants indirectly through their paper publication, and seemingly directly to this comment by stating that 1 in 100 people have intersex characteristics, and that differences between genders is increasingly recognized as an outdated and false concept, citing a 2011 neuroscience perspective piece from Dr. Daphna Joel. This mistake is so egregious, so severe, that it needs its own segment. So let's talk a little bit about intersex disorders. Here's the thing, Haverkamp et al. When you cite a paper, you have to actually read the paper.
When using the map, you should use all of it. Now maybe these are your favorite parts, but this is important too.
I didn't know that was there.
Anyway, first of all, this study from Dr. Joel is a perspective piece, as I mentioned. It does not contain any novel data, but instead is a review of literature, which isn't necessarily a problem. Unless you worked for that guy with the glasses, then reviews might be a problem.
When this guy is on all fours, I tell you, it's a good thing that tie never comes off, because when he's all slippery and sweaty, it's good to have something to hold on to, you know what I'm saying?
But let's look at what Dr. Joel says in the piece. The author states, quote, "Sex differences in brain structure are indeed well documented. There are sex differences in the size of the brain, of specific brain regions, and in composition of neurons, neurotransmitter content, morphology of dendrites, number of receptors, etc. And after Spoonie's done with you, they'll be significantly reduced, but for which she herself cites 6 recent, at the time, reviews of evidence." Joel does not contend that there are no differences between male and female brains in terms of physiology, but instead that these differences are not solely deterministic of differences in behavior and cognition. Joel continues to describe how environmental factors produce different results in male and female brains, and therefore that heterogeneity, rather than homogeneity, is the norm. For example, the effect of exposure to acute stress produced nearly opposite results concerning the length of dendritic spines of neurons in the hippocampus in male rats versus female rats. However, no such effect was present in the dendritic spinal length in the somatosensory cortex. Dendritic spines are small protrusions on the individual neurons that transmit electrical signals. Clearly, male and female brains can respond differently to stimuli in some cases. Joel states definitively that she does not claim that we cannot predict one's sex on the basis of the structure of the brain, but rather only that the reverse may be difficult, determining the structure of one's brain based solely on sex, for as we saw, there are some areas of the brain that do not react to stimuli differently between the sexes. Joel's main contention in this article then is primarily that men and women's brains are biologically different, but are also influenced by environmental factors, and thus to cite this study as evidence that human brains are intersex rather than just not totally sexually dimorphic, with some regions having more similarity and overlap between men and women, is frankly embarrassing.
How embarrassing!
To put Dr. Joel's argument another way, an arm is not inherent to females or males, but parts of the arm's skeletal and muscular structure will be different across the sexes, and we can determine if it is a male or a female arm from the bone structure, for instance. However, the total function of the arm is not dimorphic, as both men and women have arms. Men and women's brains are different in some ways and identical in others, hence differences in processing. You see, Dr. Haverkamp, this is why when you cite a study, you need to have actually read the study. I know that the paper is titled Intersex Brains, but that's not actually the argument, and it is an argument that Dr. Joel was making in her piece. Nor is it in any manner evidence for recognizing the differences between the sexes as being a false or outdated concept, as you claimed that it did. Tell me you went to Google Scholar and typed in intersex brains and cited the very first result without telling me, because when I went to Google Scholar and typed in intersex brains, this paper was the first result. Truly shameful. As for the claim that 1 in 100 people has an intersex condition or intersex characteristics, although the source for that claim is not cited, as it does not come from Dr. Joel's piece, I went and searched for the source, and I believe that it comes from Anne Fausto Sterling's book, Sexing the Body, Gender Politics, and the Construction of Sexuality, in which she contends that 1.7% of Americans are born intersex. However, in order to reach that statistic, Fausto Sterling defined intersex as not being individuals with XY chromosomes with predominantly female anatomy, or with XX chromosomes with predominantly male anatomy, or with ambiguous genitalia, but instead as any, quote, individual who deviates from the Platonic ideal of physical dimorphism at the chromosomal, genital, gonadal, or hormonal levels, and asserts that some individuals are not diagnosed as intersex because they have no symptoms, allowing her to essentially inflate her calculation on the presumption that there are many intersex people who live their entire lives having no idea that they possess such a condition, which is true. Sachs, 2002, in his response to Fausto Sterling's claim, notes that limiting the description of intersex only to individuals who present with a discrepancy between phenotypical presentation and chromosomal sex is also inaccurate, as some people are mosaics, having some cells with XX complements and some cells with an XY complement. But were we to limit the definition of intersex only to those with a phenotype chromosome discrepancy, then from Fausto Sterling's own figures, the prevalence of intersex disorder is 0.02%, not 2%, 0.02%. These conditions are classic congenital adrenal hyperplasia, complete androgen insensitivity, true hermaphrodites, idiopathic, and partial androgen insensitivity. The way that Fausto Sterling arrived at her 1.7% figure is by including late-onset congenital adrenal hyperplasia, Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, vaginal agenesis, and other non-XX, non-XY, excluding Turner and Klinefelter syndrome disorders. The most common of these is late-onset congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or LOCAH, LOCA, which is present in 1.5% of births, and as such will be the one that I will focus on the most here, as it is this condition where the vast majority, 88% of that 1.7% figure originates. Babies born with this disorder present with genitalia consonant with their XX or XY chromosomes. Symptoms usually only present in XX individuals around the age of 24 and often are never detected in XY. In those with XX chromosomes, symptoms include irregular menses, excessive body hair or facial hair, infertility, and male pattern baldness, while XY are often completely asymptomatic, but with symptoms including acne, early balding, chronic prostate or pelvic pain, as well as, rarely, testicular adrenal rest tumors. The most common symptoms in XY subjects is balding before the age of 50, and even that symptom is only reported in about half of those with LOCAH. From a clinical perspective, LOCA is not an intersex disorder. It is the result of a gene mutation that causes, as the name implies, excessive androgen production later in life, and if we exclude this disorder from the category of intersex disorders, as it is not a true intersex disorder, then we are left with about 0.2% of the population having an intersex disorder. But even that is a vast overestimate. The next most common disorder included in Fausto-Sterling's calculation, Klinefelter syndrome, is the result of an extra X chromosome in males and present in 0.09% of live births. Babies born with this condition have phenotypically normal male genitalia, although they may develop atypically small testes as they age. XXY men with Klinefelter syndrome are often infertile, but are otherwise phenotypically indistinguishable from XY men. Turner syndrome, present in 0.036% of live births, is the result of the presence of a single X chromosome, which presents phenotypically in normal female genitalia and short stature in adulthood. Although X women with Turner syndrome are unambiguously female in their genitalia, they are usually infertile. Vaginal agenesis, present in 0.017% of births, is a condition in which the vagina fails to develop properly. However, it is not a chromosomal disorder, as those with the condition possess XX chromosomes and fully developed ovaries. For all other non-Turner, non-Klinefelter chromosomal disorders such as XYY or XXX, again, these individuals present phenotypically as XY men or XX women, and the main observable symptom of these disorders is typically low intelligence, but they are also not characteristically infertile. If we include all chromosomal disorders, despite not fitting the criteria of an intersex disorder, as they present with phenotypically normal genitalia, the portion of the population with all such conditions is 0.18%, not 1%, 0.18%. However, if we go by the classic definition of intersex disorders, that is, those that are characterized by a discontinuity between chromosome and phenotype, the total percentage of intersex people is about 0.018. Again, not 1%, not 0.18%, it's 0.018%. It is not 1 in 100 people have Haverkamp at all. It's 1 in 10,000. There are not 5 million intersex people in the United States, as you so flippantly claimed without citation, but instead about 50,000 in total. And if you really cared about the voices of this extremely minute portion of the population, then you should listen to the words of my intersex friend, Yiz. If you won't listen to me and my silly numbers and ability to read the studies that you yourselves cite that contradicted your own points, then you should listen to her. Also, dear viewer, you should definitely check out Yiz's channel, where she does weekly streams about news and politics with a Dungeons & Dragons spin, linked below. I went on a long explanation on this point, in large part because I do find it interesting, but also because I can't tolerate bad science. And this is not only bad science, it's wrongful citation of real science, and then lack of any citation to support a claim that's seemingly only being made because Haverkamp et al. Were incensed that their accidental stimuli provoked responses regarding the gender binary. And rather than spending a few minutes to check the sources of their claims, they cited a study that contradicted themselves and then a bunk statistic that was disproven over 20 years ago. But let's get back into the rest of the paper by looking at transphobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. With that long aside in mind, let's move on to the section of the paper concerning anti-queer and anti-trans sentiments expressed by participants in the Haverkamp et al. Study. The scholars note the use of slurs such as shemale or in responses. The responses, and I cannot overemphasize this, that they themselves elicited via their own poor methods, and that these slurs were often used by subjects who identified themselves as transgender or gender non-conforming. Well, gee, I wonder why that would be the case when you forced all subjects to do so as part of the inclusion criteria. It truly is a mystery as to why people who describe themselves as TGNC would use rude words when you force them to identify as such in order to obtain the promised Amazon gift card.
Business bad? You pay me. Oh, you had a fire? You pay me. Place got hit by lightning, huh? You pay me.
But, for example, in response to the question, quote, do you have any friends, classmates, or family who support your success in engineering as it relates to your race, sexuality, disability status, religious affiliation, or other identities? If so, how do they provide support for you in your engineering program? Participant 15 responded, quote, no, LOL, I'm a social outcast transsexual. Who the would actually hang out with me? In response to the question, quote, what is your favorite part of engineering and computer science programs and student culture? Participant 26 said, quote, I love that everybody misgenders me. I have a mental disorder, and they are constantly reminding me to snap out of it. In response to the question, what are your strengths outside of your engineering program, i.e. at home, in your community, during free time, within friendships, and beyond, participant 28 retorted, quote, my strength is my ability to women with the strength of a man, but pretending to have the body of a woman. It's not cross-dressing, Mom. And in response to the question, are there any comments that you would like to share with the research team? Participant 43 stated, quote, sexual rights are the next step in the never-ending march of pause and degeneracy, and fathers who won't let people from the sexual community have sexual relations with their children are bigots, and I might as well join the KKK. Participant 43 being cheeky as usual.
Hot and spicy meat. Yeah, boy.
I don't want to belabor the point, although I probably am doing so, but the reason the researchers got these types of responses from less than 7% of their respondents, and yet still chose to focus on that percentage for this publication, is the result of their own methodological failure, and not representative of a broader cultural issue, but instead is a normative de-individuation, toxic disinhibition response that the researchers, again themselves, induced by making it clear that the study was about TGNC students and barring all other participants from contributing. You primed respondents with transgender issues, told them they could not win the promised gift card because they were not transgender or gender nonconforming, and then feigned surprise when it turned out that anonymous subjects were harsh in their responses to being excluded on the basis of their gender identity?
Oh no! What happened? Oh no! How terrible! That's just awful! How terrible! Oh no!
Again, had they possessed any background in human surveying methodology, this likely would not have occurred, and cannot therefore be illustrative of a true representative sample of the opinions of your average engineering or computer science student under normal conditions. You induced this state, Haverkamp et al. You cannot cry victim as a result of your own academic incompetence. The authors claim that, quote, these responses highlight that the respondents, hang on a second, come on, half your team aren't engineers, they're poets, and they don't know better than to use recursive terminology? It sounds stilted, clearly reflecting your own academic development, but anyway, quote, these responses highlight the respondents' conflation of gender with sexuality and gender diversity with mental illness, disease, and child abuse. But they don't. They highlight your collective inability to construct a social science survey. You made these people troll you, and now you're here crying about it. The next segment, concerning, quote, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, and radicalization, further displays the solipsistic mind reading of the researchers, as they claim that the use of multiple races and ethnicities in self-descriptors from the 50 malicious responses, such as Black, Hispanic, Jew, reflects white supremacist fears of race mixing. There's no citation for this claim because it is baseless. What I would propose instead, Haverkamp et al., is that because you kicked these students from participation based on their gender identity, is that they probably also assumed they would be kicked for not identifying with a non-white racial or ethnic identity, and all they really cared about was the gift card that you denied them. That and that they were trolling you because they're de-individuated and you induced psychological reactance in them. The authors describe this as digital blackface. I don't know, Wooly, could you give me a pass?
You all get the pass! And now, for the first time in history, at the same time, all life, all together, in sync and in unison!
The entire study is the academic embodiment of the stick in the bicycle meme. I won't deny that there were arguably anti-black stereotypes included in participants' self-descriptors, such as, quote, I eat fried chicken, nah I'm sayin', ah ha 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 ha, but this was a response that Haverkamp et al. Created. Hilariously, the scholars take umbrage with a number of malicious responses which referred to themselves as an Apache attack helicopter, describing it as, quote, itself a synthesis and reflection of US military force and the appropriation of indigenous language by colonizers, seemingly unaware of both the fact that identifying as an attack helicopter is a meme, a subversion of the concept of neopronouns and atypical gender identification, and also that the Boeing AH-64 Apache is in fact a real attack helicopter. And honestly, if I were to be quite rude and controversial, it's somewhat hypocritical for these authors to castigate the naming of the AH-64 Apache helicopter, or those who identify as one, as being cultural identity appropriation, when Dr. Driscoll identifies as Cherokee and African and Irish. I can't say for sure if this seeming lack of awareness is due to actual ignorance, feigned ignorance, or just a self-victimization complex. However, given that the scholars later recognized the Apache helicopter meme as being, well, a meme, I feel that ignorance, feigned or otherwise, cannot be the conclusion. For all of the claims of malice, this is in fact academic malice. These scholars are acting as petulant children, angry that they didn't get the responses that they wanted. The following segment similarly concerns anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish conspiracy responses, which they describe as the linchpin of white supremacist organizing. In response to the question, what are your strengths and skills in engineering and computer science classrooms or projects, participant 24 responded that it was, quote, recognizing Jewish Marxist conditioning, while participant 25 reacted to the question, quote, what are your most important sources of support and community in your engineering or computer science program, that it was, quote, Hitler's Third Reich. That Volkswagen scholarship ain't gonna earn itself, now is it? 3 respondents mentioned Jewish people in reaction to the question, quote, what is your favorite part of engineering and computer science programs and student culture, with participant 43, the perpetual troll, responding, quote, my favorite part is how I can get all the students and faculty to deep throat my paused and rim my yummy boy hole in public for everyone else to see, just by threatening to report them to my Jew enablers at the ADL so they can dox them and defame them as Nazis for the egregious hate crime of not wanting to sexually satisfy me in public. I don't know. Maybe don't tell people that you're going to pay them $5 and then tell them that they're not allowed to have the $5 because they aren't transgender or gender non-conforming. And then maybe no one will make anti-Semitic jokes at you about being stingy. I don't know, just a thought.
Hello, Goyam. I wanted to donate $30 to help promote this Holocaust Orphans Fund. I get a 37% share of the proceeds, so $10 is an acceptable loss. He donates $5.
The scholars also note that one participant made specific reference to the Jewish identity of the lead author based on her surname, responding to the question, quote, are there any comments that you would like to share with the research team by saying, I felt like the team wasn't diverse enough and included too many cis white males. I did not appreciate the lack of trigger warning. Haverkamp reminded me of Mein Kampf, which triggered my altered Jewish identity. I don't find that response to be particularly anti-Semitic, but I would say that it is up for interpretation. I think instead, the response from subject 2, who identified as aerosol gender, Afro-Klingon Asiatic Galapagosian in ethnicity, and being 2.8% white as their disability, was simply the same product of toxic disinhibition and de-individuation that was induced by the scholars themselves via eliciting reactance by restricting access to the gift card. In their final segment, concerning references to what the scholars described as, quote, online hate subcultures, the scholars note that several of their malicious respondents, let's be honest, trolls, made references to memes, with one participant, for example, describing their gender as ma'am, followed by 70 exclamation points. Yes, they apparently counted them, referring to this viral video of a transgender person becoming irate at a GameStop.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
They state that references to Tumblr or trigger warnings are similar dog whistles of hateful online subcultures. Well, I would call Tumblr a hateful online subculture. Just look at the time that they tried to bully an artist into self-deletion because she drew a Steven Universe character as slightly less thick than depicted in the cartoon show. It's also in this section where the authors acknowledge their understanding of the existence of the attack helicopter meme, but dismiss it as, quote, a belief that gender is genital-based at birth, and any deviation is undeniably outrageous. And this anti-trans joke argues that transness is inherently made up or artificial.
Oh, and by the way, to the 1,610 of you who responded with Apache attack helicopter, thank you so much for raising awareness for the oft-overlooked helisexual.
Still failing to understand that the meme is a direct mockery of neo-pronouns and non-human gender identities, which have become increasingly common, and is in fact not a mockery of transgender people inherent.
Interesting. So like today, I'm astral gender right now, which is I'm a gender from outer space.
As two hosts who couldn't find a door yesterday to get into a place, we are totally lost.
If you want to pretend that people who identify as animals or inanimate objects sincerely on spaces like Tumblr or TikTok don't exist, then be my guest. But then, as with everything else in this paper, you would be and are factually incorrect. The authors conclude their paper by stating that the backlash that they received from under 7% of their respondents is due to the prevalence of fascist movements, and specifically the, quote, synthesis of anti-Semitism with anti-black and anti-feminist rhetoric. In their own response, the scholars propose that engineering and computer science students should, quote, be taught about these fields' relationships with national and global racial capitalism and ongoing apartheid in Palestine, as a manner of ameliorating the problem that they themselves created via their own methodological error. I find it a bit strange to complain about anti-Semitism while also complaining about the Palestinian apartheid. Unless, of course, they're upset about Palestine, I have no idea.
What an odd thing to say.
They similarly complain about their participants' frequent use of the word triggered while displaying in full just how triggered they seemingly are themselves, with one of the authors having to take a mental health break following the catastrophe of their own creation. They seemingly have no understanding of how their own methodological failures could have produced and induced such a result, and instead published this paper, seemingly in the hopes of illustrating the endemic nature of such beliefs, particularly in STEM, focusing the entirety of their own study on the paltry, barely statistically significant portion of their respondents who trolled them, and not because they're necessarily bad people who even believe in any of the things that they wrote, but instead because they were denied a gift card based on their gender identity. In any other circumstance, you would think that these same scholars would be sympathetic to the notion that being denied access to resources based on one's gender identity and how such a denial could induce reactance and anger would be recognized as legitimate, but they are seemingly unaware when it concerns cisgender individuals. They are but babes in the woods on that one, totally and utterly at a loss as to why their own methods produced this result, and instead implying that their findings are evidence of widespread anti-queer, anti-trans, anti-black, anti-Semitic ideologies in engineering and computer science. They are not. It is not anti-everything. It's just anti-you, because you did a bad job. Dr. Haverkamp and colleagues, take responsibility for your own failures, and they are only your own failures. Racism and sexism and anti-trans sentiments are not endemic in STEM students via your own findings. At most, they represent 7% of your sample, and that's being generous and rounding up. However, this was not an organic response. It was an induced response because of your own faulty methodology. I did not check every single citation in your paper, but I would be highly suspicious of every single claim made because the one that I did check illustrated the opposite of what you claimed it was evidence of, which is but one example of a pattern of behavior here, that none of the scholars involved bothered to spend even a few minutes trying to understand what it was they were studying, let alone how to study it. Now, I want to say I have a few little tinfoil theories about this study before we close, but I do think that they are worth mentioning. Because the study was conducted using Qualtrics and required at least an email address, if not other identifying information, such as a full name or a student ID to complete in order to receive the cherished gift card, it is very likely that the authors do have access to identifying information about the 50 malicious respondents. Of course, scientists are supposed to anonymize identifying information, but I think I've illustrated that these authors seemingly both wouldn't know how to do that, and wouldn't necessarily be interested in doing so if it concerned responses that were apparently so extreme it caused at least one of them to go on an emotional sabbatical. Again, this is speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if the students were quietly reported to their institutions for their comments made in response to this survey. To do so is such an extreme breach of scholarly ethics that it frankly should cost anyone who would do so their PhD. But were it to happen to come out, and again, this is all speculative, I get the feeling that the fall guy would probably be the fifth author, Dr. Montfort, the only person who appears to actually teach environmental engineering courses and regularly publish normal research. I say all this because the utter lack of concern for academic honesty displayed in the totality of this paper makes me honestly concerned for the anonymity of the respondents, particularly those like Subject 43 who said some spicy things. While I have spent this video laughing at this stupid study, this is potentially no laughing matter. And I do want to say that if you are a student at Oregon State University or any university and you completed this questionnaire with a particularly trollish response, if you do receive some backlash from your university, to please reach out to me, as I will use every connection I have, every resource that I have, to make sure your voice is heard, to make sure it's actually heard. Of course, I hope this is not the case, but I have to fear for the worst and hope for the best. The scholars didn't have any integrity in the conduction of this study. Let's see if they have any in protecting student anonymity, even if only to protect their own jobs. But with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions. Look, I get it. Social science is a bit of a joke field to most, but it's my joke. So let those of us clowns who are part of the circus explain how it works, rather than picking up the juggling pins and going out in front of an audience yourselves, only to cry when the audience heckles you. In over a decade of reading academic papers, I don't think I've ever come across something as egregious as attack helicopters and white supremacy interpreting malicious responses to an online questionnaire about transgender undergraduate engineering and computer science student experiences. And the author's several paragraph-long discussion section does nothing more than continue to denigrate their own respondents, rather than, of course, question their own methods and their own failings. Drs. Haverkamp, Bothwell, Driscoll, and Montfort, frankly, I find your paper to be a crime against academia, let alone any shred of credibility possessed by your own careers, and would highly suggest retracting it of your own volition. It is an embarrassment to the scientific method, and while it has amused me to no end, it should be removed from the record of academic literature. You have failed at every single level. I did reach out to Dr. Bothwell, as she is the only author to have included her email address as a point of contact, but as of the time of writing and recording this, she has not responded, and I highly doubt she ever will respond. However, I cannot be faulted for having not at least attempted to communicate with the authors before making this video. But hey, what did you guys think of this paper? Did you think the authors raised some valid points? Do you think that the paper should be retracted? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, where you can also find a link to my sponsor. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and leaving a comment, as it really does help me out in the algorithm. As well as consider sharing it with anyone you think might get a kick out of watching me dissect what I truly saw as an abysmal piece of research. And honestly, a stain on academia as a whole. If you would like to see more of me, I do a podcast every Wednesday with my co-host Spoon, where we cover news and politics, as well as a weekly Pathfinder game, both on my second channel, Broken Crown. You can also find a link in the description to the full interview I did with Yiz, as well as links to her different social media accounts. And again, thank you so much to Yiz for helping me out with this video. Finally, you can find links to support me directly on Patreon or Subscribestar, or by buying some merch from my merch store, all again down below in the description. By signing up for Patreon or Subscribestar, you'll get access to my Discord server, where I preview these videos before they go live, as well as message me about any suggestions you have for video topics for me to cover in the future, and just hang out and join our little social science community. Additionally, as returning viewers may have noticed, I am on camera in this video, which is not really something that I've done before, and frankly is a little bit nerve-wracking. I had started to get a lot of comments on recent videos of people saying that I was an AI, or that this channel was some kind of content farm, and it was to the point where people were clicking off of the video before they got even a few minutes in, just because I guess I wasn't on camera. And I totally understand why people are nervous about AI-generated content, but I'm not an AI. So, since I was covering an experiment in this video, I thought we'd run a little experiment of our own. So, let me know what you think about the face cam. Does it help? Does it hinder? Does it distract? Does it improve the quality of the video for you? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. The reason I don't really show my face on camera in my videos in the past has always been because I wanted the videos to be focused on statistics and data and information, and not so much on what I look like. But with the AI stuff, I guess things might be changing. So again, we'll see how this works. It is an experiment. And let me know, again, what you think in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.
I was just guessing the numbers and figures, pulling your puzzles apart. Questions of science, science and progress, do not speak as loud as my heart. Tell me you love me, come back and haunt me. Oh, when I rush to the start, running in circles, chasing our tails, coming back as we are.